hope, aspiration, connection, belonging, culture. These are the stories we tell. Join me as I speak to storytellers from across the world and hear about what inspires them to create the reality they want to live in. Domo, welcome to the Stories We Tell. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a new kind of podcast, so let's see how it goes.
Yeah. So, Toma, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you and want to have you as one of my very early guests is there probably is no storyteller like you, certainly in the Bitcoin world, right? You blazed the trail with writing stories of fiction about Bitcoin, and I've certainly been inspired by that. That's what inspired me to write my novel on Bitcoin, a story of a book of fiction on Bitcoin as well. But certainly, the trail that folks like you blazed helped that. So why don't we start with what are your thoughts on storytelling in general,
Yeah,
right? And then specifically how we use that as a tool to draw people into Bitcoin.
sure. Well, storytelling is an art, and I don't mean just it's a fancy. It literally is art, right? A form of art. And what is a form of art? It's an attempt to concretize some ideas into a form that you can touch them, because human beings have ideas, and you can't really touch ideas, but you can make a sculpture which physicalizes an idea, or you can have an idea about how things ought to be in the world, and you can concretize it through the telling of a story. And we, of course, tell history, which contains the word story. We try to tell the story, the stories that actually happened, and learn from them and take ideas from them. And so this idea of stories and ideas are very, very closely linked together, both of ideas that we learn from what happened in the real world and what we'd like to see happen or what might be possible. And I think that's what stories are. And I think Bitcoin is a super interesting phenomenon that's happening in a few ways. One is it is a story that's unfolding before our very eyes, and more interesting, like there's many stories unfolding before our very eyes, but what's so unique about it is almost an unbelievable story. Right? Like if it weren't for the fact that we could verify it, it reads like an idealized story. Like the story of Satoshi Nakamoto is almost unbelievable, right? And I wrote in one of my pieces called The Legendary Treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto how if it weren't for the fact that we have documented and proved and verified everything that happened, this would very quickly be dismissed as a myth, right? Here comes somebody out of the blue wearing a mask, essentially. Nobody can identify who they are, just like a superhero in the stories we tell about superheroes, which aren't true. But here he comes and he manages to hide behind a mask and no one can figure out his secret identity. And he does something that requires a superpower to do. He solves this unsolvable mathematical problem that's known as the double spend problem or the Byzantine generals problems, and he solves it, and it was proven that you couldn't solve it, but he finds a clever way to solve it in a way that nobody had thought it could be solved. So he solves this problem, and this solution to the problem is an invention that he gives to the world. And this invention, like this crazy computer that seems to come only from fiction, is alive. Nobody can stop it. It takes on a life of its own. It recruits people. He disappears. He leaves behind the mask. He vanishes. Again, nobody can find him. Nobody knows what became of him. It's a great mystery. But the thing continues to thrive and survive. And it goes to battle, in a sense, or gets attacked by all the greatest evils in the world, and it fends them off. I mean, this reads like a comic book, right? It's almost unbelievable, and yet it's happening before our eyes, and we're participating in the story. So like we're living in a story, which is amazing. And I think this, to me, is the inspiration that Bitcoin gives to want to tell its story in an emotional and idealized way. Not just to say, there is this thing, and to take the passion out of it, to leave the passion in it, because the passion that comes and the emotion that comes in stories and the ideas attached to them is what gives them their life. And so here we have this wonderful opportunity to live in a heroic story and be part of a heroic story that's true. And so to strip that away would be to strip away perhaps the most important part of Bitcoin. Like, what is the meaning of Bitcoin? Its meaning is what all these superhero comic books tell us. Like, you can fight evil, you can beat evil, you can be great. We can have heroes. And I know that there's this saying, never meet your heroes, and Bitcoin have kind of embraced that. But I wrote one piece called "Don't Tell Me There Are No Heroes in Bitcoin," because I think that there actually are a lot of heroes in Bitcoin, and of course Satoshi was the greatest of all. But it's an incredible story, and it's important to tell the story from this perspective, and not to just shy away and say, "Well, it's just some math and just some physics, or it's just money." It's a whole lot more than that. It's the reason we tell stories.
And this is a story that people know, at least in broad strokes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if you're not deeply involved in the Bitcoin world, you've heard this story. Why do you think it is, Toma, that there's so few of us, right? We're less than 1 million people, I would say, right, who are captured by it. Why has the story not permeated more
Well, it's
broadly?
early days. It's early days still. I mean, I think this story is incredibly compelling and is catching on quite quickly. When you think of other stories in history that took time to catch on, you know, they took hundreds of years often, right? Or they took place through force. There was a violent revolution somewhere, or a violent overthrow of a government, and the new government says, "Okay, this is what you all believe," but nobody really believes it. They know that the story is we were forced into something by violence. Bitcoin has forced nobody into it through violence. It only works through persuasion and consensual acknowledgement. And it takes to become convinced of the story that Bitcoin is good money, which isn't the whole story, right? Which is what you're talking about, that there's 1 million people of. To become convinced that that is where you should go, convinced, not forced at the point of a gun, that you can do very quickly to somebody, but convinced takes time. And it's a complicated story too. So I think there's a distinction. I think if you ask the man on the street, have you heard about Bitcoin? 95% of people will say, yes, oh, I've heard about it. They won't have the whole story. They'll have some other interpretation of the story. And this again goes to the importance of storytelling, right? Like, they have heard a version of the story that says, oh, didn't it die? Isn't it something that the government's going to stop? Isn't it associated with drugs? Isn't it associated with terrorism? Isn't it bad for the environment? Doesn't it waste energy? So all these stories have been spun up, and so they sit with the man on the street. But it is interesting that everybody's heard some story of Bitcoin. Like, the brand awareness of Bitcoin, despite the fact that it has no marketing campaign and no advertising and no direct employees, and is is pretty remarkable, right? Like, the word has gotten out. How did this thing that was created by somebody who nobody knows who they are, and who abandoned the project who left the project after less than 2 years after having launched it, how is it that 15 years later everybody's heard of it and the thing continues to grow? And I think that's a really interesting story too. And the story of how different people hear different versions of its story and ultimately are persuaded, is itself another interesting story. So I like the passion that people who fall in love with the story have for sharing the story is fantastic. And it is, there's these two paths by which Bitcoin grows. People tell other people, "Oh, you should buy some because you'll get rich quick," and then other people tell them, there's a real story here. There's a story about justice and heroism and truth and rights and freedom." And the two stories aren't necessarily in conflict with one another. But the get rich quick one is one that people get kind of excited about, or they want to get rich quick, and then they go to shitcoins because they hear, well, they can get you rich quick too. They've got the same narrative. And sometimes people see, oh, well, the price goes down, so it's not necessarily a true story. But the story of it's unstoppable, and it's a new form of money, and it's just, and it's fair, and it adheres to the way that human civilization thrives. That's a story that never changes. There's never a moment where it kind of goes down. It just keeps going up and up, even through its rough parts. And it is going through its own hero's journey. Like, in all these superhero tales or these hero stories, the hero doesn't just da di da show up and everyone says, "Oh, you're great. That's fantastic. Thanks for showing up. We'll all do what you suggest." They confront challenges. They confront crises. They come close to the verge of death, and they're attacked by bad guys, and sometimes you don't even know they're the good guy until something reveal, there's some pivot. And I think that's a lot of these the part of the story of Bitcoin. It's like people can vilify it, right? There's stories that do attempt to vilify Bitcoin, and it's not until you are able to step a little bit further back and say, wait, maybe the people who are vilifying it are actually the villains, right? Who's doing what sort of good in the world, and what are we fighting for, and who's right and who's wrong? So it makes you question all of these things about what's right and what's wrong. And it's a personal journey that you end up going through. So you have a personal story. And again, I think this is where it's so exciting to be a part of Bitcoin at this point in time, because it's taking the real world and putting it through a story that we've heard 100 times before, but we thought it was constrained to the realm of fiction. And no, it's not. It's like, here's the real world battle: good versus evil, honesty versus deceptiveness, all these massive themes that we have experienced through storytelling, we're now experiencing in a very unique way here, because it's not the same story that plays over and over and over. Like, the story that plays over and over and over again in our lives is some politician shows up, he promises or she promises to make everything fine. We fall for their charm, their personality. We vote for them, and they let us down. And it's a cycle that just repeats over and over. It's not an interesting story anymore. It's just like, which politician's going to let us down now? Do you want to vote for politician A or politician B, who if you actually genuinely have fallen for them again, you have some hope, and then they let down the hope, and so this becomes a cycle of our life of like, we keep getting let down by leaders, and then we have a different story now to live, which is we're our own leaders. We have an opportunity to take control back away from leaders. We have a system without leaders. We have rules without rulers. And the way that it came to be is so fascinating. It's shrouded in mystery and secrecy, and uses secretive technologies, cryptography, and hiding. And so it's sneaking around trying to forge a way for itself. It is this counter movement. And so there's so many different ways to tell this story. Many of them, for me personally, revolve around Satoshi and paying homage to the brilliance of his mind to invent what he did, the uh, carefulness of the execution to maintain his hiding, both for his own sake and for the sake of the project, and then his tremendous benevolence that he gave this to the world and didn't exploit it for his own benefit. He never cashed in the coins, never spent them. He didn't seek fame. Nobody knows who he is. He didn't seek power. He's not at the top pulling the strings saying this is the next fork and that is. So he didn't seek money, power, or fame. He just did this for the sake of giving the world a gift. And so like that is truly heroic as well. And it's again almost unbelievable in this world, because every one of these politicians that we see, or businessmen we see, are in it for themselves. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but when they're in it for themselves through deception, or we find ourselves uh, powerless in a system that they've built that we've opted into, we're resentful because we want to be free. In the Bitcoin system, we're all equal, we're all free. Satoshi he doesn't even play anymore, but he doesn't have power over us, and none of us have power over each other, right? So it's a phenomenal story.
It is interesting, Tomo, that one of the things you touched upon is there are two parallel stories that are happening, right? One is the story of Bitcoin itself
Mm-hmm.
that draws people in, but then once they're in, and we've seen this with Bitcoiners, especially the hardcore Bitcoiners, it's a pattern that repeats over and over again, that they go through their own story, right? And
Yeah,
perhaps they're hooked by the number go up narrative.
yeah,
That's what brought them in the
yeah,
first place. But then they go through their own personal transformation as they understand
yeah,
more about what this this asset is, what this
yeah.
network is, what
Right.
uh, this community, to the extent that there is one, of
Yes.
plebs that support it.
Yeah. When
Yeah,
you watch someone go through their journey, uh, it's exciting because you don't know exactly where they're going to end up. Are they going to maintain their conviction? Are they going to grow their conviction, or are they going to fall off the wagon? Betray, try to make money quick with an altcoin, or cave into government pressure and back off. And when you see the people who maintain their conviction and grow their conviction, that becomes a story in and of itself. Like you take a look at Michael Saylor as an example. There's a really exciting story there when you actually follow his story. He first saw Bitcoin in 2013, wrote it off, said this is going to go the way of online gambling or online poker, and ignored it. And then various things happened in his life, and he rediscovered Bitcoin again in 2020 and started to go all in and went all in further and further, and hasn't, and learned aggressively in Bitcoin, and then began teaching about Bitcoin and put his money where his mouth is, his personal fortune, his corporate fortune, and has maintained the conviction over and over and over again. Every quarter, you everybody gasps when they hear MicroStrategy bought another 5 million, 50 million, whatever it is in Bitcoin. There's a story there about conviction and unwaveringness, and every quarter along the way, especially, he started coming in the mid teens and watch it go up to 69 and watch it go back down to the high teens. That would have thrown a lot of people off, right? And you can imagine inside the company, people must have been saying, are you sure you're leading us in the right direction? Is this the end of the thing? And time after time and again, conviction, and also the manner in which he went through this, right? He didn't go about this in a sneaky way. He said, MicroStrategy is concerned about, if you rewind, MicroStrategy is concerned about its balance sheet, about the dollars on its balance sheet. We're going to buy either gold or silver or Bitcoin. And they told everybody this before they did it. So if you weren't on the ship, you could abandon ship, right? And then he once again said, we're going to now that we've done this, we're going to buy more Bitcoin. We're going to go on a Bitcoin standard. If you don't like this idea, I'm offering to buy your shares, right? The company offered to buy back shares. And the amazing part of that story is, well, maybe some people sold their shares, but more people bought shares. Like there was a flood of people who said, I want to go on this journey with you, Michael, with this company, MicroStrategy. We want to sail on the good ship MicroStrategy to the new world. And off he went. And it's just been unending conviction ever since. So it's an amazing story to tell. And there's lots of ways to tell it, um, but again, here's someone, and you just see his excitement, right? And you see his conviction, and you see how many people he's persuaded, and how excited they've become. So it's a story of leadership, and it's a story of conviction, and it's a story of intelligence there too. I don't want to make it seem like Michael Saylor's the great hero of Bitcoin, but he's someone who deserves and warrants our admiration, and whose story deserves to be told, because it's another story. It's not the story of the creator of Bitcoin, as Satoshi says. It's the story of how Bitcoin help someone find their way and find justice in this world, and find other people who want to go on the same journey with them to this land of justice that also contains wealth, right? There's nothing wrong with abundance and wealth, and the alignment of conviction and truth and integrity with wealth is really another very powerful idea. And I think that story, as it continues to play out, right? The chapter's not over yet, or the story's not over yet, but where it goes is really exciting. Lots of people love to follow it. Again, also a story filled with challenges, right? It's not just, oh, he bought in and he succeeded and what a genius he is. It's like, no, there were moments of truth where he might have abandoned ship, but he didn't, and that conviction will pay off in the long run. And there's a lesson there for that, for other people to say, perseverance matters, right? There's a virtue called perseverance, and and that's not just blindly doing what you said you would do in the face of all evidence. It's continuing to do what you would do, knowing what you know, despite the fact that the world is fighting against what you know is right. That's where perseverance really comes in. So a great
And in a
lesson.
small way, Tomar, right? Obviously not comparable to Michael Saylor, but some of us who've been through a couple of Bitcoin cycles have learned to develop that muscle, right? We sit through wild swings in our purchasing power in Bitcoin, right? I mean, you could call it the
Yes.
dollar price of Bitcoin,
Yeah.
but it certainly strengthens you in that way.
Absolutely. I think we all learned the lesson. The Michael Saylor story is very public and very big, and that's what makes it a story that's kind of interesting, worth telling at large. But the story of individual Bitcoiners is also interesting. I think back again, and I to the fork wars, the block size wars, as they were called. There was an incredible story there as well, right? And again, little guys versus big guys, right? The big guys were all the big corporations early into Bitcoin, the mining companies, the GBTCs, the Coinbases, and they wanted to make a change that would essentially end the decentralization of Bitcoin. And the little guys fought it, and the little guys ended up winning, and they ended up winning because they were committed and they were smart and they were ready to die for it. They were ready to blow up Coinbase and their own fortunes in the process, and it was ultimately that got all the big companies to back down, because they could see that they weren't going to win. It was essentially a game of chicken, and the plebs took the steering wheel out and threw it out the window and said, like, you've got a choice. You can steer out of the way, or we can go head on and both end this thing, because this thing without its decentralization isn't worth anything. And that was this moment of truth. And when it came time for me to write about that, I actually wrote it as though it was a fiction. Like, I didn't fictionalize anything. It was all true reporting, but I wrote it in the style, which was fictional, of a soldier's memoirs, right? Like, for someone in the trenches fighting the war, this personal memoir, and going through the emotions that we went through at the time, not just saying, well, A happened, then B happened, then C happened. It was like, what was the exciting, thrilling, terrifying, finally relieving moment in the block size war? And I'll leave it. I'll give you the link. You can put in the show notes for people to read it, because it's a bit of a lengthy piece called, what did I call it? Cyber Soldier, Freedom Fighter. And I'm talking about, like, this is the first war that was ever fought in cyberspace. And how dare I call it a war? Because no blood was spilled,
Yeah,
nobody was killed. But
I'll
what's the
certainly
metaphor
put that in the.
that
I'll put
makes
that
it
in the show notes, Tomer. I'm
suitable to
sure
call it a war?
the viewers who haven't read it would certainly appreciate reading it.
Yeah,
Uh, I do want to talk about one of your stories, but which is the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto. But
yeah,
there's a question before that tying
yeah.
into the Michael Saylor, and then you mentioned the word abundance, right? Did you find in your journey that when you started off, you had a very specific idea of what money would bring you, and well, I certainly did, right? I used to equate money to happiness, and I know
Hmm.
a lot of others who did, right? Well, yeah. If only I had more money, then I'd be just fine, right? I'll buy the stuff that I need, and then you start diving deeper and deeper into Bitcoin, and then which is really the study of money,
Hmm.
among several other things, but it deepens your understanding of money. And as you become more and more of a Bitcoin fundamentalist, you realize, oh, I certainly realized that it's not about the money. I mean,
Hmm.
we need a stable money, but it doesn't
We have to
end
be
there. Like, true
careful when we use
abundance
that
is not
expression. Like,
money.
it's not about the
Did you
money; it's
find that
about
happen to you?
the money, right? Like, there's a subtle. It's not about having more money than everybody else so that you can use it frivolously. It's about people having and using a money that's fair and just and doesn't steal from common people. And so it's about justice, right? It's about just money. So it's not just about money, it's about just money. And and this is where kind of you can have a lot of fun with the words, but you realize that a society with a broken money is a broken society. And that's what we're experiencing, all of us, right now, right? This story is set in a world where there's a broken money, and you have an elite class that's taking advantage of the broken money, and you have a middle class that's withering away and shriveling up and losing its hope, and its younger generation doesn't know how to even afford housing, food. All these things are problematic, and there's a lack of health, and so the whole civilization is unhealthy as a civilization, and the individuals within it are mentally unhealthy, physically unhealthy. They're feeling hopelessness. That's the backdrop of the story of Bitcoin, right? It launches in the middle of a financial crisis caused by bankers and governments that ordinary people had nothing to do with the cause of it. They were driven into it, and so it takes place in this terrible world, and it's a story of hope that the whole civilization can rise above it through the actions of one particular hero who invents the thing, and then a flood of other individuals who embrace it and spread it out throughout the world. And so you end up with all these stories in different locations in the world, of how hope is brought back about, and the people who drive hope through storytelling, through software development, through constructing new businesses. They're really exciting series of stories.
Yeah, indeed. And speaking of an exciting story, the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto. I know, Tomo, when we were last chatting,
Yeah,
you told me something incredible about how the ending,
yeah,
right? What the treasure is, how that came
right.
about while you were writing it. But
Yeah,
would you mind sharing, first of all, the outline of that story, and then the
sure,
the ending itself, the
sure.
realization that hit you?
Yeah, and I really encourage people to read it. And if there's some spoilers here and you haven't read it yet, uh, then I then I almost encourage you to pause this and listen to it or read it. There's a Guy Swan reading of it, and I'm actually going to be reading it on another podcast that I'm recording tomorrow, but I'm not sure when it's released. So there might be a live reading by me on the Bitcoin Matrix that people can pause and listen to. If I tell you about a movie, it's not the same as watching the movie, but I'm going to tell you about the movie, or the story here at least. The story came about. I found that myself and a lot of other people I was talking to were experiencing like a spiritual awakening, by having become Bitcoiners. Whether it was finding religion, or finding a belief in hope again, or some kind of spiritual connection that our lives lacked before. A lot of this was happening, and the night before I sat down to first start writing this piece, I had a very lengthy conversation with another Bitcoiner about spirituality, and we touched on a lot of topics. So I went to sleep with a lot of these ideas in my head, and I woke up the next morning and I wanted to write something about this. And so I wanted to write why Bitcoin creates a spiritual awakening for people. And I sat down and I started to put my thoughts together, and I realized it began with this story of Satoshi Nakamoto. And I've mentioned bits and pieces of this story, but I said, like, when you hear this story, you would be inclined to disbelieve it, to say, okay, this is a nice story of fiction, but it can't be real. It can't be that some mysterious person appeared with a solution to an impossible problem, and created a multi-billion-dollar personal fortune out of it, but never spent it, and didn't do this for money or power or fame. But it turns out it's true, right? And so the more that you're confronted with the truth of it, the more it shatters things that you didn't believe, which is what makes the story so hard to believe in the first place. Like, we are raised to believe that we're selfish beings who ultimately want money, power, and or fame. And so there's no example of someone who can't do it. But Satoshi comes around and can't, and does this thing, not for money, power, fame. We also live in a society where we're told, well, the government is all powerful. And here he comes and single handedly creates something that the government can't stop. And all the governments together can't stop. So it's this, here he's done this thing, and we're told that corporations can take everything over and acquire and purchase, because that's what big companies do. And no company can acquire and take over Bitcoin. No group of companies can try. Facebook tries to form an alliance of Visa and this and that to create whatever it was that their token was, and they fail, and they come at it. So all these people come at this invention, and it stands there and it shatters your beliefs. Corporations are not all powerful, you learn. The government is not all powerful. People can be so brilliant as to solve problems that other brilliant people claimed were impossible. They had proofs that you couldn't solve the double spend problem. Well, he solved it anyways. And people can do this to give the world a gift rather than to succeed in their power, money, or fame. So this one story shatters all these beliefs. It tells you these things that you believed, all these assumptions that you had about the government and yourself and corporations, they're not true. They may be generally common, but they're not absolute truths. And if you believe that they were absolute truths, you now have all these things contradicted. Like so much of what you walked around in the world assuming it doesn't believe. So it's shattered. It shatters all your old beliefs, all these cynical beliefs that we're raised with. And what does that do? That leaves a vacuum. And it leaves a vacuum to say, well, what might the world be like? What, in fact, is it like if corporations aren't all powerful and governments aren't all powerful and money, power, fame are not the only things that can drive me and my friends and the people who I live around? Maybe we can love each other. Maybe we can build things that won't be taken over. And so, and that's the source of the spiritual awakening, right? Because now you live in a different world than the world you lived in before. You presumed you lived in a world where all these things were true, and now your eyes are open and you see these things are not true. And so this one story, aside from being this incredible invention that does all these other things, gives you the inspiration, it gives you the hope to start asking questions and exploring them without the premise that this must be true because the government says it is, or this must be the outcome because a corporation will ultimately take it over, or this is doomed to a terrible ending because people are terrible. Like none of those things are true. So you now live in a new world that you have to examine. And as I was writing this piece, like one chapter after another of this came to me that Bitcoin asks you to look at money and ask what is money, what is pure money, what is money separated from institutions, separated from the government, separated from central banks, separated even from matter itself. And when you ask what pure money is, I go on this story to explain what it is. So I won't answer what pure money is here. I'll leave an inducement for people to go and read it. But you realize it's something that's separated from all these other things that claim to speak on its behalf, can be pure and innocent and good, despite the fact that these institutions that have wrapped their tentacles around it are not good. And so when you separate the things, you say, well, no, it's the institutions that are evil. Money's not evil. Money's just a peaceful exchange between two people who want to exchange something that they have of value with each other. There's nothing harmful about that. That's actually, that's, there's two ways to get something from somebody: by force or through trade. And the money allows you to do it through trade, force being the evil. So it's the antithesis of evil. And when you ask that question about money, you start to then be able to explore. And I think this is, again, one of the things that happens for Bitcoiners. They start to untangle all these other ideas from the institutions that tackle them. Like, what is education apart from the institutions that claim a monopoly on it, right? Education isn't sitting in a classroom and being lectured at. Education is learning some truth about reality, and maybe even discovering new truths about reality. That doesn't have to happen in a school that's government funded and has a curriculum dictated from on high. People learned long before governments took over learning, but now we have this monopolized system of learning. And the same is true of what is healthcare, aside from medical regulatory establishments and pharmaceutical companies and all these other things. So you start to separate all the entanglements that exist in our civilization around us. And all this begins by you asking the question, what is pure money? And finding a very surprising answer. So you start asking, what is pure anything? What is pure education? What is pure healthcare? What is pure spirituality? Aside from the institutions that claim to speak on behalf of spirits. And so there's just this amazing path of discovery where you can learn for yourself. It's not necessarily easy, but it's much more genuine than just being fed facts and dictates that you can't verify for yourself. The whole verification piece comes in. And I go through a number of these things, and then I end up with saying, well, so what really is the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto? He left behind 1 million coins, and it's the biggest pile of Bitcoin in the world, right? So it's the most valuable pile of Bitcoin. It's worth billions of dollars, and if it becomes all the money in the world, it'll be the biggest pile of money in the world, and nobody can touch it. Everyone can see it, right? The blockchain is perfectly visible, but the way that Bitcoin works is you cannot steal somebody else's pure money. Pure money cannot be stolen. And so I go into what I think the implications of that are, and I won't spoil that, other than to say that's not the final thing that I point out. That it's just a monument to what the real treasure that Satoshi teaches us is, and it's about ourselves. So I'm just going to leave it at that because I can't do it justice in summarizing it. And I encourage people to listen to or read the article. So I'll maybe leave it at that.
Yeah, we certainly don't want to give out too many spoilers and want to encourage folks to read that article because it is, or read that story, I should say, because it's quite remarkable. But Tomo, when you wrote that, especially the ending, right?
Yeah.
What I remember you telling me that that insight was almost a spiritual insight that you received.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of one of the things that's amazing about writing. The best writing is channeled from some kind of spiritual place. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but if you completely surrender yourself into the creative process, you end up in a state that many people just call flow. And you end up in the flow state. I found myself in the flow state as I was writing that particular piece. I didn't think I was going to write about the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto. I thought I was writing a piece called "Why Bitcoin is a Spiritual Awakening for Many." But when I completed the first four parts prior to writing about the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto, all this stuff was in me somehow, and I felt like I heard a voice, whether it was from within me or without me. It's saying, now you can actually put together the story of what Satoshi's million coins represents. And so I started writing, well, they are this untouchable monument that everyone in the world will see, that's going to be, and it's going to stand forever because of the blockchain is going to live forever. And that was pretty profound. And I was hearing what it stands for. Like, it stands for the fact that one man can do something that other people say is impossible, and it stands there forever to show that. And it does represent the fact that corporations aren't all powerful and can't take control of or acquire everything, and it stands there forever to show that. And it shows that governments can't dictate everything and that people can take control, and stands there forever to show that. And just a list of things came over that we can understand purity and we can understand ourselves. And it's like Satoshi's coins and Bitcoin are this indestructible monument to the spirit of all the things that caused the spiritual awakening in it. And then tears were like pouring down my face as I was recognizing and realizing all this. And then the big insight came that the coins are not themselves a treasure, and that something else is that, which is tied to this process that people go through. That's the real treasure. What comes out at the end for you personally is a treasure that's not about money. And that's what's really remarkable. I feel that that's kind of a message that was somehow given to me or discovered by me. I don't really know. I personally feel, I say discovered by me for the people who aren't spiritual. I feel like from a personal perspective, there was a message that was given to me from something very powerful and very good in the universe, to tell people, you are good, you are the greatest treasure that exists, and discovering yourself and being yourself is a big part of what this gift is. So the personal journey, right? It's not just Michael Saylor's journey, which can serve as an inspiration, but your personal journey is the most valuable thing you will get out of Bitcoin. Not the money, but the discovery of your potential, yourself, what you love about you, and what it takes to love yourself.
Yeah. And so, and certainly when I heard you tell that story, Tomer, it was incredibly moving, right? The way you described it, and because it's very real. It's I've had the similar journey, right? That
Mm-hmm.
that discovery that it's not about the money, right? It's
Right,
about something deeper than that,
right.
a deeper a connection to the world, to the universe, even.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe changing tracks a little bit, Tomer, from that story to a story ahead. Do you have any exciting plans for new stories to tell? Anything you can disclose?
I never really know when the next thing is going to come. I have an out at one point, being creative or taking a look at a creative side is a very unpredictable experience. So at one point, I had written several stories about Bitcoin, and I thought, okay, maybe my job is to be Bitcoin's storyteller. I actually thought that, and I had written a children's story, which I haven't published yet. People can find it on the Once Bitten podcast. It's also about Satoshi Nakamoto, but it's a story for kids, right? I'd say the legendary treasure of Satoshi Nakamoto is for adults. Uh, this book, Satoshi Nakamoto and his Bitcoin invention, as you can even tell by the title, is for like 7 to 12-year-olds. And so I had written this children's book, and I was inspired to publish it, and I was inspired to write a whole collection of Bitcoin stories, one of which would have been the legendary treasure, and a whole bunch of others. But things being what they are, one thing led to another, and I kind of forgot about the project. And I had a science fiction idea, which I've written a very light introduction to it. And again, science fiction or science fact, when things are projections into the future, they might be true, uh, which is um, which is a story called "Moving Heaven and Earth," and I can give you the link on that. And I've published that just as a dialogue on Medium, but so it's published as a story being told from one person to another. But I'd like to make something bigger out of it. I'd like to actually turn it into a film or a series or something like that. And it really just speaks to what might Bitcoin do for us over not the course of the next 100 years, not even the course of the next 1,000 or 1,000,000 years, but over the course of 100 million or 200 million years. And it's interesting because we've never had something that was built to last forever before, but Bitcoin is designed to last forever. That you're never going to run out of hash solutions, so you'll never run out of block identifiers. It can keep on going forever. The database is designed to just be able to grow forever and ever and ever without breaking. The ability of it to store the proof of work, it stores it in 256-bit number, which is again as big as all the atoms in the universe. So it could store the energy for mining of the sun and many other stars combined. So, and it encourages us to become masters of energy capture. And like the more energy you capture, the more dominant a player you can be in mining Bitcoin. And so there's this infinite competition to produce abundance of energy that doesn't destroy us, because you don't want to destroy yourself. And ultimately, the idea behind this is, well, we should be able to become powerful enough, thanks to Bitcoin's incentives, to be able to move around stellar bodies, like to be able to move around asteroids, ultimately moons, planets, maybe even the sun itself. And if we can move the sun itself, then we could actually turn our whole solar system into a starship and move our whole solar system through space. We don't have to leave Earth. Earth is coming along for the ride with the sun. We can go wherever we want to in the galaxy. Um, it takes a long time, right? It takes a long time to figure out how to capture that power. It takes a long time to go from point A to point B, because as much as I'm wearing a USS Enterprise shirt, they invented warp speed, which seems to contradict the laws of physics. So they could get from one star to another during an episode, but that's not how the universe seems to be set up. The distances between stars are vast, and it takes millions of years to get from here to there. So the idea of going in a tin can from one star to another is not impractical. But staying on Earth while the Earth follows the sun in tow of its gravitation to another star is possible. It just takes 100 million years. You have to lower your time preference. And wouldn't that be something amazing to do, not just for the tourist value, but for the fact that it would actually save the Earth, because the sun is going to run out of gas in 400 million years or something like that. It seems like forever, but that time will come. And if we can actually reposition the Earth, like move towards a younger star and reposition the Earth in orbit around a younger star, because we have the power to do that thanks to our power mastery and our survival as a species, then we can save the whole Earth. It doesn't have to die in 400 or 500 or 600 million years. It can get a new life around another star. And once you figure out how to do this, you can repeat it till the heat death of the universe, for trillions and trillions of years. So it's a really amazing idea. And I think you can tell incredible stories around it. But I've been struggling to do it. This has been a challenge for me that is, like, I'm excited about it. I've written bits and pieces and different perspectives on it, but I'm overwhelmed by the challenge of telling a story of that epic a magnitude. So I'm still stuck. And it's like, here's this project that's going to be the death of me, because every time I try to work on it, I inch forward and then I feel dread that I can't accomplish it.
Yeah, well, I that is probably the grandest timeline I've heard of in a story.
Mhm.
And is the premise that because there is this money that's built to last forever, right? This built to last and be sound forever. That's what enables humanity to make
In
this
part.
type of progress
In part,
over
yeah, so that's
tens
one
and
condition.
hundreds.
The other condition is that this money is fueled by an insatiable demand for energy. And so the more like in order to move the sun, that takes a lot of energy. You have to capture the energy of the sun. What's the incentive to do so? And ultimately, well, if the incentive is money, then that's incentive enough for humans because humans do love money, right? Like, it's the thing that keeps us going. And the more the more energy we create. Like the beauty of having money that's tied to energy is really our source of wealth. Like if you think about, if you have a nice house, it didn't just build itself. It took a lot of energy to build it. It took energy to cut down the trees and extract the materials and bring them all to where you are, and for people to put them up and assemble them together. It's all about energy. So our wealth is our energy. And we have no idea what we might be able to produce, what kind of wealth we might be able to create if we are actually able to capture all of the energy potential that the earth provides, that the sun provides. This is something that's often referred to as the Kardashev scale, the scientist who said, well, there's different kinds of potential species in the galaxy. One is a level one, which we're not even at yet, which has mastered the way to capture all the energy of their planet. Another, the level two, would be that has managed to capture all the energy of their star. And then the third would be a civilization that's managed to capture all the energy of their galaxy. So of all the stars in the galaxy, like such a civilization, if one existed, if we have the potential to become that, is a civilization that takes billions of years to come into being. And many aspects of it never connect with each other because the vast distances of the size of a galaxy are absolutely colossal. So there's lots of really cool rabbit holes to go down in thinking about those things. But it occurred to me one time when I was thinking about Bitcoin, it's like, wow, this thing is actually going to turn around our view of energy, because right now energy is vilified. It's a very easy to produce. I shouldn't say it's very easy. It's ultimately within the path of our future to produce ridiculously vast amounts of clean, undestructive energy. And when we are able to do that, we'll be able to direct the energy to all sorts of causes, our own wealth, but also ultimately our own salvation, saving the planet over the course of hundreds of millions of years. It's just lower your time preference, right? And I think that's the interesting aspect of this thought exercise. If you lower your time preference logarithmically, exponentially, first instead of thinking about tomorrow, you think about next year, and then instead of thinking about next year, you think about your lifetime, and instead of thinking about your lifetime, you think about your heirs, and you think about the next 100 generations, because we end up with having something that doesn't break down, Bitcoin, and encourages us to have more energy. The potential is unlimited. And so you can actually think about this future, right? Michael Saylor actually talks about this. He talks about time locking Bitcoin to the future so that you can direct your energy, your will here today into actions that take place in the future. And I think that's the kind of, I'm trying to just blow that out beyond the wildest imagination. Like, let's take it to prevent the end of the earth at the time when the sun burns out. So that's kind of the inspiration of the concrete aspects of the story for the.
And did you say you're thinking about making this into some sort of video format
Why not?
or
Like, I'd love to do, like, I don't even have the full uh, treatment ready. I don't know how to present this story. There's so many different ways I have partially written something that was originally going to be a novel, but became, the novel's not exactly the right form to describe it in, maybe like an epic myth of some sort. So I don't really know exactly how to present. I'm not skilled enough yet to present it in its finality, but the challenge of writing this story will hopefully develop the skill within me, if I can figure out how to do it all. There's a personal growth challenge for me, but I have lots of other things I'm doing at the same time in my life too. I'm not 100% dedicated to this thing.
so maybe for the last part of our conversation, Tomo, why don't we move from the sublime to the slightly more banal, which is how implementation details, right? So you're talking about film or video, and to me, it's an incredibly powerful storytelling medium because you have a multidimensional canvas,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can play with space and time
Yeah.
and all sorts of things that I mean, books and writing are incredibly powerful in and of themselves, but video just allows you to
Yeah.
expand quite a bit more. Now, so to be able to tell a grand story like the one that you're talking about, right? This 100 million years, or maybe even a simpler story, right? Maybe a story about inner space, right? A person's rather than outer space,
Mhm.
someone's spiritual journey.
Mhm.
How would one go about uh, funding and building something like this? Is there an appetite? Have you noticed for films and Bitcoin?
There's a lot of there's a lot of people who I've been involved in two short films. One significantly more popular than the other. Bitcoin is generational wealth, but
Oh
Bitcoin
yeah.
is beautiful. Has had a lot of positive feedback too. It's just a much shorter piece. Um, and the way, and I'm not the expert. I don't come from a filmmaking background. I was asked by Bitcoin as generational wealth is kind of like I fell ass backwards into everything that made that happen. I didn't even have the idea to write the story. It was Louis Liu from Mises Capital who asked me to write something about Bitcoin being generational wealth, because that was a topic that was near and dear to his heart. And so when I finally wrote the piece and I read it to myself, I was like, this could make an interesting movie. Well, Louis, would you help us make a movie out of it? And he was enthusiastic about that. And I had just met a director the week before that happened. So I asked him if he wanted to make it. And he said, yes, he just needed an editor. And so the next Bitcoin meetup we went to, lo and behold, an editor shows up, and then the whole thing got made. And there were a few other really nice things to how it happened. So sometimes the universe just hands you something on a silver platter, which it did for me with that case, which maybe was a bit of a not the best thing to have happened, because I didn't really have to work for it, and so I don't know the answer to the question of what I need to do to make everything come together. I've got a lot of ideas, like this science fiction idea and musicals and stories about the background of Satoshi. Like there's a lot of cans that I've got open that I don't know how to bring them to fruition. But I'm actually hopeful that in the next bull market, as the enthusiasm rises, as the capital availability for doing artistic projects rises, people will want to do these things not just for the sake of fueling the bull market, but because they actually want to leave a mark, create some genuinely amazing art that represents the values of Bitcoiners and the Bitcoin civilization, which will help be some of the seminal works. Not it might some I might have something to do with it. Others might have. Others certainly will have something to do with it. But I think any culture of any value has always left behind great monuments, great artworks, great buildings, great whatever. And I think this is the question: is to say, okay, what will be the early and yet seminal achievements of the Bitcoin community that are cultural? And if I get to play a part in that, I'd be really honored. And if I don't, I still will be greatly in appreciation of it, and maybe we'll have some influence on some of the things that get produced. But I'm very excited about the cultural aspects of Bitcoin, because I think it is ultimately a cultural movement, a movement towards those things that actually are about the greatness of the human spirit, the potential of the human spirit, the positive aspect of the human spirit. Like, we have two sides. We have our dark side, we have our weaknesses, and we have this great potential and these great strengths. And I think Bitcoin is saying, be your best. And so, well, to build buildings that say, this is the best we can do, to make artworks that are the best we can do. That was something that was certainly captured in the Renaissance, right? That period of history. You look at their sculptures and their buildings that are still standing, and they're amazing, amazing compared to what we've built in the last 50 years, when our culture has been more pessimistic and more cynical about what human beings actually are. So it should be a stark contrast between what Bitcoiners develop and what fiat culture has brought about. So I can't wait. I can't wait to listen to the music. I can't wait to see the sculptures. I can't wait to hear the stories. Maybe even get involved in writing one or two of them.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, we've yet to see the Sistine Chapel transposed into
Yeah.
the Bitcoin world, right?
Yes.
I would certainly love to see something like that. We have metaphoric monuments, like you mentioned,
Mhm.
Satoshi's treasure,
Yeah.
right? His wallet is a metaphorical monument to selflessness and to all the values that we strive
Yeah.
for, right?
Yeah.
As we go through this Bitcoin spiritual journey. But I think seeing
Right.
that transposed to something more physical,
Mhm.
I hope this is the bull market that triggers that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's it. So I think we're in the early days, but we're starting to see some real beauty, right? Like you see the contrast. I shout out to a friend of mine and whose work I admire. You take a look at the contrast of the detail, like the attention to detail and precision and clockworkness and fidelity and insight of something like the full node sculpture that Fractal and Crypt, the artist, did. Michael Saylor has one version of it hanging behind him in his interview office. But if for people who aren't familiar, well, actually, this little thing behind me right here is is something that Fractal and Crypt did. It's just a little thing, but he does these beautiful artworks that are inspired by, and you can see how they're inspired by Bitcoin. Again, the precision clockwork, everything fitting in perfectly, nature of these things with equations and energy all coming together. I think that's this early example of capturing and concretizing the spirit of what Bitcoin as an entity and a culture stand for, are comprised of and stand for. And so the more we start to see works of that nature or works inspired by those ideas, the more we can start to say, you know what, this movement has its own culture. And then we'll see how that translates into architecture. Again, I think Bitcoiners have a connection to nature that maybe no other advanced culture has had before, like no other industrial culture has had before. Industry has been kind of this separate thing from nature. It's master nature to concrete it over, to clear cut forests and build a dam and do all these other things. Bitcoiners want to live in harmony with nature and peace with nature. There's an environmental component to it. And so I think seeing how organic our architecture and our art becomes is quite possibly going to be a big part of it. But we're very early right now, right? We don't have a Bitcoin architect yet who's heroically building these things, but maybe we do. Maybe we just haven't noticed him yet or her yet.
Well, you certainly are architecting a culture, and you're a pioneer in that, Toma, in drawing more people into Bitcoin through your stories. And well, thank you for everything you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back on maybe in a few months to see how our stories are evolving.
Sounds like a great idea. Hold my feet to the fire. Terrific. Well, thanks again, Avi. It's been a
Yeah,
pleasure.
indeed. Yep. Likewise. Thanks, Toma.